Between the towering glass monoliths of downtown, Johnny Depp stepped out from the grand entrance of a luxury hotel. The air hummed with the familiar urban symphony, car horns blaring, distant chatter from pedestrians, and the faint rumble of construction work echoing a few blocks away. Johnny, dressed in his signature eclectic style, with sunglasses perched on his nose, walked towards the sleek black limousine waiting at the curb. His chauffeur, a tall man in his 50s named Thomas, stood at attention beside the vehicle. With a practiced hand, Thomas opened the rear door as Johnny approached. "Good morning, Mr. Depp," Thomas said with a polite nod. "I trust you had a pleasant stay." Johnny returned the greeting with a warm smile. "Morning, Thomas. It was fine, thanks. Looking forward to heading home, but we've got that one last stop for the photo shoot." As Johnny moved to step into the plush interior of the limo, a sudden blur of movement caught his attention. A small figure darted past him, and before he could fully register what was happening, he felt tiny arms wrapped tightly around his leg. Startled, he looked down and saw a little girl. She was completely bald, her small frame trembling as she clung to him desperately. Her wide eyes, brimming with fear, stared past him, refusing to meet his gaze. Caught off guard, Johnny crouched slightly and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice calm and steady. "Are you okay?" Before the girl could respond, an angry shout cut through the air. Her grip on Johnny's leg tightened for a moment, but then, as quickly as she had appeared, she let go and bolted, vanishing into the busy crowd. Moments later, a red-faced man in his 40s stormed over. He wore an apron with the logo of a nearby convenience store. His eyes were fixed on the direction the girl had fled, not yet noticing who he was addressing. "That little brat," he spat, his voice bitter. "She's always hanging around my store, scaring off customers. Brings nothing but bad luck, I tell you." Johnny raised an eyebrow, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "Has she done anything wrong?" "Stolen something?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. The store owner huffed. "No, but she's always touching things, wandering around, making people uncomfortable. It's only a matter of time before she causes trouble." As the man ranted, his gaze finally landed on Johnny. Recognition washed over him, and his anger was quickly replaced by embarrassment. "Oh my God," he stammered, his face turning even redder. You're Johnny Depp." "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't realize." Johnny raised a hand, cutting him off. "It's fine," he said, his tone measured. "But let me ask you again, has this girl ever actually broken or stolen anything?" The man hesitated, fidgeting under Johnny's steady gaze. "Well, no," he admitted reluctantly. "But she's always around, making the place look bad." Johnny nodded slowly, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone. "You know," he said, "I've learned that it's not fair to judge someone for things they haven't done. Maybe there's more to her story than you realize." Without waiting for a response, Johnny slid into the limousine. Thomas shut the door, muffling the store owner's final muttered complaint: "Celebrities never care about what's really going on." As the limo pulled into traffic, Johnny leaned back in his seat, his thoughts lingering on the little girl. Her frightened eyes, the way she had clung to him, it all stayed with him. "Thomas," he said suddenly, leaning forward. "Drive a little slower. I need to keep an eye out for something." Thomas glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his expression calm. "Of course, Mr. Depp. Is everything all right?" "I'm not sure," Johnny replied, his gaze scanning the bustling streets. "There was a child back there. Bald, maybe 9 or 10 years old. Help me look for her." "Certainly, sir," Thomas responded, adjusting the speed of the car. The city rolled by, sidewalks crowded with commuters, street vendors setting up their carts, and tourists snapping photos. Johnny's eyes darted from face to face, searching for the small, bald figure. Just as he was about to give up, he spotted her. "Thomas, pull over," Johnny said quickly. The limousine came to a smooth stop. Johnny stepped out, his sunglasses shielding his intent gaze. He approached the girl slowly. She sat huddled against the wall outside another convenience store, a small paper cup extended in front of her. Her posture spoke of exhaustion and defeat, but when she saw Johnny, her eyes lit up with recognition. Johnny crouched down to her level, offering a warm smile. "Hello again," he said gently. Reaching into his wallet, he pulled out several large bills and placed them in her cup. The girl's eyes widened, and without hesitation, she threw her arms around his leg once more. This time, her embrace was filled with joy. "Thank you," she exclaimed, her voice muffled against his pants. Then, looking up at him with wonder, she asked, "Are you Captain Jack Sparrow? Where's your ship?" Johnny couldn't help but laugh, her innocence breaking through the weight of the moment. "Well, love," he said, slipping into his iconic Jack Sparrow voice, "the Black Pearl is safely anchored in a secret cove, waiting for her next adventure. But tell me, what's a brave little pirate like you doing out here all alone?" Her smile faltered slightly, and she glanced around nervously before whispering, "Captain Jack Sparrow, please help me." Johnny's hand moved toward his wallet again, but the little girl shook her head vigorously. "Not money," she whispered, her pleading eyes brimming with urgency. "I need—" Before she could finish her sentence, a small crowd began to form around them. Fans, recognizing Johnny Depp, approached with phones in hand, calling his name and eagerly asking for pictures. The girl flinched, shrinking back as the growing attention overwhelmed her. Some fans jostled closer, unintentionally bumping into Johnny in their excitement. Sensing her discomfort, Johnny instinctively stepped back, his calm demeanor barely faltering. Thomas, ever vigilant, intervened. "All right, folks, give him some space," he said firmly, his commanding presence dispersing the crowd. Guiding Johnny with a hand on his shoulder, Thomas opened the limousine door and ushered him inside. Once inside, Johnny glanced back through the tinted window, his brow furrowed with concern as he watched the girl disappear into the crowd. "Mr. Depp, I'm sorry, but we should get moving." "Your schedule," Thomas began, his tone polite but firm. Johnny didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the busy street outside. After a long pause, he sighed and turned away from the window. "Yeah, I heard you," he murmured, his voice soft and distracted. Just before Thomas signaled the driver to pull away, Johnny whispered under his breath, "I'll be back." The limousine merged into traffic, but Johnny's thoughts lingered on the girl. He couldn't shake the image of her desperate eyes or the weight of her unspoken plea. A few moments later, his phone buzzed. It was an event organizer confirming his attendance at a magazine photo shoot. "Yes, everything's still on schedule." "I'm on my way," Johnny assured them, his voice calm despite his restless mind. As the call ended, he turned to Thomas. "We have a few minutes to spare, right?" Johnny asked, his tone sharper with purpose. Thomas checked the time and nodded. "About 5 minutes, sir, if we're to arrive on time." "Then let's go back," Johnny said firmly. "There's something I need to do." Thomas didn't argue, signaling the driver to retrace their route. Johnny's eyes stayed glued to the streets as the limousine navigated the city. He scanned every face, every corner, hoping to spot the girl again. When they arrived back at the convenience store, his heart sank. The crowd had dispersed, and there was no sign of her. "Pull over here, Thomas," Johnny instructed. "I'll be back in a moment." As Johnny stepped out, he turned back to Thomas. "I'm just going to take a quick look inside the store." The bell above the door chimed softly as Johnny entered. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the aisles of snacks and household items. Behind the counter, a teenage cashier was engrossed in a mobile game, barely glancing up as Johnny walked in. Johnny moved quietly through the aisles, his eyes darting from shelf to shelf, searching for any hint of the small figure he'd encountered earlier. The store was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of refrigeration units and the faint beeping of the cashier's game. After a fruitless search, Johnny approached the counter. The cashier finally looked up, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized the man standing before him. "Excuse me," Johnny began politely. "I'm looking for a little girl. Bald, about this tall." He gestured to indicate her height. Have you seen anyone like that in here recently? The cashier shook his head, his expression blank. Nah, man. Haven't seen any kids in here today. Johnny thanked him and stepped back out onto the street. The afternoon sun beat down as he scanned the sidewalks and nearby alleys, his sense of urgency growing. After several more minutes of searching with no luck, Johnny reluctantly returned to the limousine. As he settled into the back seat, he pulled out his phone, scrolling through his packed schedule. The demands of his professional life loomed large, but his thoughts remained with the girl. The car had just eased forward when a soft knock on the window startled him. Turning, Johnny's breath caught. There she was. The little girl's small face was pressed against the tinted glass, her hands cupped around her eyes as she peered inside. Her bald head was unmistakable, even through the darkened window. Stop the car, Johnny said urgently. Without waiting, he swung the door open and stepped out, crouching to meet her. Come on, he said gently, helping her into the back seat just as the traffic light turned green. The soft creak of the leather seats echoed as she settled beside him. Her small frame seemed even more fragile against the plush interior. Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyebrows raised in surprise, but he said nothing as the car smoothly accelerated. Inside the limousine, the girl's tense shoulders began to relax. Her wide eyes darted around, taking in the luxurious surroundings. Yet, Johnny noticed how she unconsciously rubbed her arms, as if trying to ward off an invisible chill. What's your name? Johnny asked gently, trying to put her at ease. The girl hesitated before answering in a small voice, Sonia. It's nice to meet you properly, Sonia, Johnny said with a warm smile. Now, can you tell me what kind of help you need? Instead of answering, Sonia pointed out the window at a building they were passing. Johnny followed her gaze and saw a large, faded sign that read ORAG above a rundown structure. Before he could ask for clarification, Sonia made a more personal gesture. She touched her bald head, then hesitantly rolled up her sleeve, revealing a dark, troubling mark on her arm. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Please help, sir." The weight of Sonia's plea bore heavily on Johnny as he leaned closer, carefully inspecting the dark mark on her arm. Her bald head, pale skin, and now this troubling detail painted a grim picture. A knot tightened in his stomach as realization began to dawn. Sonia, he said softly, his voice filled with genuine concern, are you sick? Is that why you need help? Tears welled up in her wide, fearful eyes as she nodded. Her small voice trembled as she explained, the doctors at the orphanage said I need special medicine, but they don't have enough money. I've been trying to save up. Her voice trailed off, and she gestured helplessly to the meager possessions she carried in her small bag. Johnny felt a surge of compassion and determination. Without hesitation, he turned to Thomas. Can you find parking near that orphanage we just passed? We need to speak with someone there. Of course, Mr. Depp, Thomas replied, already maneuvering the limousine to change lanes and turn around. As they approached the orphanage, Johnny noticed Sonia's demeanor shift. She seemed to shrink into herself, her earlier bravery fading into apprehension. Her small hands trembled in her lap, and she avoided looking out the window as they neared the building. It's going to be okay, Johnny assured her gently, placing a warm hand on her shoulder. We're going to figure this out together. All right? Sonia nodded, managing a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. The limousine came to a stop, and Johnny helped Sonia out of the car. The orphanage was an old, weathered building with peeling paint and a faded sign. The short flight of stairs leading to the entrance seemed daunting, almost insurmountable, as they stood at the base. Sonia hesitated, her steps growing slower and more unsteady. Just as she reached the first step, her knees buckled, and her fragile frame began to collapse. Sonia! Johnny cried, reaching out instinctively to catch her. His grip slowed her fall, but she tumbled down the remaining steps, landing hard on the pavement below. Dropping to his knees beside her, Johnny gently cradled her head, his heart pounding. Relief washed over him when he saw she was still conscious, though a small trickle of blood from a cut on her forehead made his chest tighten. "Stay still, Sonia," he said urgently, pulling out his phone to dial emergency services. As he explained the situation to the operator, his free hand remained on her shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. The front door of the orphanage suddenly burst open, and an elderly woman hurried out. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her face was etched with deep concern. "Oh dear Lord," she exclaimed, descending the steps as quickly as she could. "What happened? Is she all right?" "She collapsed," Johnny explained, his voice tight with worry. "I've called for an ambulance." The woman knelt beside Sonia, her movements surprisingly quick and steady despite her age. "I'm Miss Abigail," she introduced herself, her tone carrying both authority and warmth. "I'm the caregiver and director here." "Sonia, oh, my dear girl, what have you done now?" Miss Abigail gently brushed Sonia's cheek, her eyes filled with affection and sadness. Turning to Johnny, she sighed. "Sonia has cancer. She's been growing weaker, and her balance has been affected. We've tried to manage her care as best as we can, but," her voice cracked, and she trailed off, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Before Johnny could respond, the piercing wail of sirens filled the air. An ambulance rounded the corner and came to a stop at the curb. Two paramedics quickly exited, wheeling a stretcher toward them. As the paramedics assessed Sonia, her small, trembling voice broke through the commotion. "Captain Sparrow," she called weakly, her hand reaching out toward Johnny. "Will you come with me, please?" Johnny's heart clenched at the fear in her voice. He glanced at Miss Abigail, who nodded encouragingly. "Of course, Sonia," he said, taking her tiny hand in his and squeezing it gently. "I'll be right there with you." One of the paramedics turned to Johnny with an apologetic look. "I'm sorry, sir, but only one person can ride with her, and it should be her guardian." Johnny nodded in understanding, then leaned down to Sonia. "Listen, sweetheart," he said softly, "Miss Abigail will ride with you in the ambulance, but I promise I'll meet you at the hospital, okay? My ship will be right behind yours." Sonia's lip trembled, but she nodded bravely. "You promise?" "Pirate's honor," Johnny replied with a reassuring wink. Sonia managed a small, hopeful smile as the paramedics gently loaded her onto the stretcher. Miss Abigail climbed into the ambulance beside her, giving Johnny a grateful nod as the doors closed. The vehicle pulled away, its lights flashing but sirens silent. "Thomas," Johnny said firmly, turning to his chauffeur. "We're following them to the hospital. Can you keep up?" "Of course, Mr. Depp," Thomas replied, already moving toward the limousine. As they followed the ambulance through the busy city streets, Johnny sat in silence, his thoughts racing. The city blurred past him, a cacophony of lights, motion, and noise, but his focus remained on the ambulance ahead. Arriving at the hospital, Johnny quickly made his way inside. The sharp scent of antiseptic and the harsh fluorescent lights were disorienting, but he pushed forward, heading straight to the nurse's station. "Sonia," he said to the nurse at the desk. "She was just brought in." "Where is she?" The nurse glanced at her chart. "She's being examined by the doctor now," she said, gesturing toward a curtained area. "Are you family?" Johnny hesitated for a moment, then replied, "I'm a friend. I brought her in." The nurse nodded sympathetically and motioned for him to wait nearby. Johnny took a seat in the corner of the bustling emergency room, his mind filled with questions. What more could he do for Sonia? How could he help her when she needed so much more than he'd ever imagined? For now, all he could do was wait and hope. Johnny nodded, understanding the need for the tests. "Please keep me updated," he said, his tone firm but polite. He returned to the waiting area where Miss Abigail sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes lifted to meet his as he approached, still shimmering with emotion. "Mr. Depp," she began hesitantly, her voice tinged with both gratitude and doubt, "I don't even know how to thank you for what you've already offered. It's more than we could have ever dreamed. But, are you certain? This isn't a small commitment." Johnny met her gaze with steady resolve. Miss Abigail, this isn't charity. It's simply the right thing to do. Sonia deserves a fighting chance, and so do all the children at your orphanage. He hesitated briefly before adding, I've been fortunate in my life. I've had opportunities, resources. It's time I used them for something meaningful. Miss Abigail's face softened, her lips trembling as tears began to spill. You have no idea what this means to us, she said, her voice breaking. To Sonia. To me. Johnny placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Let's focus on getting Sonia through this first, he said gently. One step at a time. The curtain leading to Sonia's examination area shifted slightly, and a doctor stepped out. He was a tall, composed man with a clipboard in hand, his expression professional yet kind. Mr. Depp, the doctor asked, glancing between Johnny and Miss Abigail. Johnny stepped forward. How's Sonia? He asked immediately, his voice laced with concern. She's stable, the doctor reassured them. Her fall caused a minor laceration on her forehead, but fortunately, there's no sign of a concussion or serious injury. We'll keep her under observation for a few hours and conduct some blood work to check her overall condition. Johnny exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Thank you, doctor, he said earnestly. Can she be moved to a private room after the tests? The doctor nodded. Yes, I'll arrange that. It might take some time, but we'll ensure she's comfortable. As the doctor walked away, Miss Abigail let out a shaky sigh of relief. Thank the heavens, she murmured, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Johnny turned to her, his expression thoughtful. Miss Abigail, I need to know more about Hope's Haven. I want to understand how I can help, not just Sonia, but the orphanage as a whole. Miss Abigail hesitated, overwhelmed by his offer, but eventually nodded. Of course, she said quietly. I'll tell you everything. A little while later, Johnny and Miss Abigail sat in the hospital cafeteria, the clatter of trays and hum of conversations filling the background. Miss Abigail spoke at length about the orphanage's struggles, the dwindling funds, the outdated facilities, and the growing needs of the children in their care. The city has grown so much over the years, she said, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. But it feels like the children are being left behind. Rent is high, and donors are fewer and farther between. We've tried to apply for grants, but the process is long and competitive. There are days I wonder how much longer we can keep going. Johnny listened intently, his mind already racing with ideas. What if we could create something more sustainable, he suggested. A new space, better resources, and support to ensure every child gets the care they deserve. Miss Abigail blinked, her expression one of disbelief. A new space, she echoed. Yes, Johnny said firmly. A modern facility with enough room for the children to grow and thrive. We could start a campaign, raise awareness, bring in sponsors, he paused, then added, and I'll personally contribute to getting it off the ground. Tears welled in Miss Abigail's eyes once more, but this time they were tears of hope. You would do that? For us? For the children, Johnny replied with a small smile. And for Sonia. No child should have to fight alone. Back in the ER, Sonia had been moved to a quiet, private room. She was lying on the bed, her small frame dwarfed by the hospital sheets. Her pale face lit up when she saw Johnny enter the room, and she reached out a tiny hand toward him. Captain Sparrow, she said weakly, her voice still carrying a hint of playfulness despite her exhaustion. Johnny grinned, stepping closer to take her hand. Lass, he said, slipping into his iconic pirate accent. I told ye I'd be right behind ye, didn't I? Sonia giggled softly, her eyes sparkling despite the heaviness of her situation. Are you staying? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For as long as you need me, Johnny promised, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. Miss Abigail watched from the doorway, her heart full as she witnessed the bond forming between the unlikely pair. She knew that with Johnny's support, there was finally hope, not just for Sonia, but for the future of Hope's Haven. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that brighter days were ahead. Johnny's brow furrowed, but his voice remained calm. "Okay, do what must be done. I want the best possible care for her," he replied firmly, giving the nurse a reassuring nod. The nurse offered him a brief, understanding smile. "I'll inform you of her room number once we've completed the tests," she said before turning back to her work. She made a quick note in the chart and then moved purposefully toward the ER curtain to check on Sonia. As the nurse disappeared behind the curtain, Johnny's mind wandered. He thought about how brave Sonia had been throughout this ordeal. What could he do to cheer her up after everything she had been through? She must have been shaken enough, he thought. Then it hit him. He remembered the stash of merchandise from Pirates of the Caribbean in his limousine. It was a small gesture, but maybe it would bring a smile to the little girl's face, something to brighten her spirits after such a difficult day. Johnny hurried outside the hospital, his footsteps quick as he made his way through the parking lot. His eyes scanned the area until he spotted the familiar silhouette of his limousine. When he reached it, he wasted no time opening one of the storage compartments and rummaging through its contents. A triumphant smile spread across his face as his hands finally closed around the items he had been searching for, a golden pirate coin trinket and an authentic Jack Sparrow hat, both remnants from his Pirates of the Caribbean days. Before re-entering the hospital, Johnny turned to Thomas, who had been patiently waiting by the car. "Thomas," he said, "I think I'll be staying here for the night. Why don't you take the limo back and bring my regular car tomorrow? No need to attract more attention than necessary." Thomas nodded in understanding. "Of course, Mr. Depp. Shall I bring anything else for you in the morning?" Johnny thought for a moment. A change of clothes would be great. And maybe some books or games for kids. I have a feeling we might need them. With a final nod, Thomas drove off, leaving Johnny to make his way back to the hospital. As he entered the lobby, something caught his eye, a DVD vending machine. His face lit up when he saw Pirates of the Caribbean among the available titles. The machine whirred softly as it processed his payment and dispensed the movie, adding another element to his plan to lift Sonia's spirits. When Johnny returned to the ER, he found it empty. The soft hum of the hospital filled the space. Frowning slightly, he made his way to the nurse's station. After a brief pause, he asked, "Where have they relocated Sonia?" The nurse looked up from her paperwork and offered a quick, professional smile. "Oh, Mr. Depp. She's been moved to room 207. Miss Abigail is there. You can head up now." "Thank you," Johnny said with a nod, a sense of relief washing over him. He made his way down the corridor toward Sonia's new room. As he approached, he saw Miss Abigail engaged in conversation with a doctor outside the room. He joined them just in time to catch the tail end of their discussion. "Stage 3 malignant melanoma," the doctor was saying, his expression serious. "We need to perform surgery to remove the primary tumor and affected lymph nodes as soon as possible. After that, we're looking at a treatment plan that may include chemotherapy and radiation, depending on how she responds." Miss Abigail's face fell at the mention of extensive treatment. "Doctor," she began hesitantly, her voice trembling slightly, "is she going to be okay?" The doctor's gaze softened as he gave her a reassuring look. "From our earlier tests, the girl is stable. The CT scan revealed no concussion despite the fall, and we've addressed the wound. She's in the best condition possible for the procedure. Of course, there's always risk with surgery," he paused before adding gently, "but we'll do everything we can. It's too soon to say with certainty, but we need to take this one step at a time." Johnny stepped forward, his voice firm. "Doctor," he said, glancing at the name tag, "Dr. Marvey, I want Sonia to receive the best possible care, regardless of cost. Can you make that happen?" The doctor blinked in surprise, clearly recognizing Johnny but maintaining his professional demeanor. "Of course, Mr. Depp. We have an excellent oncology team here. However, I must warn you that the expenses for this kind of treatment can be substantial." Johnny nodded, his expression resolute. "I understand. Please proceed with whatever Sonia needs. I'll take care of all the expenses. And I'd appreciate it if we could keep this as private as possible to avoid media attention." The doctor nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "We always maintain patient confidentiality, Mr. Depp. Now, as for the timeline, we have a surgery slot available tomorrow morning. Given the malignant nature of Sonia's cancer, I'd recommend we proceed as soon as possible." Johnny and Miss Abigail exchanged a look before nodding in agreement. "Let's do it," Johnny said. "What do we need to do to prepare?" As the doctor outlined the pre-surgery procedures and necessary consent forms, Johnny felt a mix of anxiety and hope. The urgency of the situation weighed heavily on him, but he was determined to do whatever it took to give Sonia a fighting chance. With the surgery scheduled for the following morning, Johnny took a deep breath and prepared to enter Sonia's room. He clutched the pirate hat and coin in one hand, the DVD in the other, hoping these small tokens might bring some comfort to the scared little girl. As he took his seat next to her bed, Sonia's eyes lit up at the sight of him. She was propped up in the hospital bed, looking small and fragile against the stark white sheets, but her smile was bright. "Captain Sparrow," she exclaimed weakly, her voice filled with genuine joy. Johnny smiled warmly and settled into the chair beside her bed. "Hello there, young pirate," he said, slipping easily into his Jack Sparrow voice. "I hear you're about to embark on quite the adventure." Sonia's smile faltered slightly, fear creeping into her eyes. "The doctor said they need to do surgery," she whispered. "I'm scared. I'm not as brave as you, Captain Sparrow." Johnny leaned in, his voice gentle but firm. "Now listen here, love. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means doing what needs to be done, even when you are scared. And from what I've seen, you're one of the bravest pirates I've ever met." He reached out, taking her small hand in his. "The doctors are going to help you, Sonia. They're going to fight this sickness inside you, just like we fight sea monsters in our adventures. And when it's all over, you'll be ready for new adventures. What do you say? Are you ready to be brave?" Sonia hesitated for a moment, then nodded, a determined look settling on her face. "I'll try, Captain Sparrow. I promise." Johnny smiled and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "That's my girl. Now, I've brought you something special." With a dramatic flourish, he presented a pirate hat and gently placed it on Sonia's head. It was a little too big, sliding down over her eyes, but her giggle made it all worthwhile. "And this," he added, pressing a golden coin into her palm, "is for good luck. Keep it close and remember, Captain Sparrow is rooting for you." Sonia's eyes widened as she examined the coin, turning it over in her hands with wonder. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Just then, Miss Abigail entered the room, followed by a nurse pushing a small TV on a cart. "Look what Mr. Depp arranged for us, Sonia," Miss Abigail said with a smile. "We're going to have a movie night." As the nurse set up the TV, Johnny turned to Sonia with a playful wink. "How about we watch some real pirate adventures?" he asked, holding up a DVD. Sonia's face lit up with excitement, but fell slightly as she glanced at the 4 in her arm. "But I'm not allowed to eat anything before the surgery," she said sadly. Johnny didn't miss a beat. "Ah, but that's part of the adventure," he exclaimed. "In this movie, there are times when even Captain Sparrow goes hungry. It's all part of being a true pirate. What do you say we brave it together?" Sonia giggled and nodded, her earlier fears fading in the excitement of an impromptu movie night. As the opening credits began to roll, Johnny settled back in his chair, grateful for this moment of normalcy in the chaos of the day. He watched as Sonia became completely engrossed in the film, her eyes wide with wonder at the swashbuckling adventures on screen. Midway through the movie, Johnny leaned in close to Sonia, curiosity lighting up his face. "Sonia," he asked gently, "can I ask you something? Why did you keep going into those stores if you weren't buying anything?" Sonia tore her eyes from the screen, her expression turning serious. "It was always my dream to eat those snacks," she admitted quietly. "We don't get treats like that at the orphanage." Just being there, seeing all the colorful packages, made me feel like I could have a normal life someday. She paused, a small smile playing on her lips. Plus, the air conditioning felt nice. It was good to get out of the sun, my skin didn't itch as much. At least, until the owners got mad and chased me out. Johnny felt his heart ache at her words, amazed by the simple dreams of this brave little girl. He made a silent promise to talk with Miss Abigail about improving conditions at the orphanage, determined to make some of Sonia's dreams come true. As the movie progressed, a nurse came in to take Sonia's final measurements and blood samples for the surgery. To Johnny's relief, Sonia barely noticed, too wrapped up in Captain Jack Sparrow's adventures to pay attention to the medical procedures. Johnny shared behind-the-scenes stories from filming, delighting in Sonia's laughter and eager questions. For a few precious hours, the hospital room transformed into a world of pirate adventures and Hollywood magic. By the time the credits rolled, Sonia's eyelids were drooping, and she was fast asleep. The pirate hat sat askew on her head, and the golden coin was clutched tightly in her hand. Carefully, so as not to wake her, Johnny moved to the small couch in the room and turned off the TV. As he settled in for the night, his eyes stayed on Sonia's peaceful form. The soft beeping of the machines created a steady rhythm in the background. Johnny reflected on the day's events, the missed photo shoot, and the possible career repercussions. None of it mattered. What truly mattered was the little girl sleeping before him. As he drifted off, Johnny made a silent promise. He would do whatever it took to see Sonia through this battle and give her the chance at the life and adventure every child deserves. When the first rays of dawn filtered through the blinds, Johnny stirred, momentarily disoriented before the events of the previous day came rushing back. His gaze went straight to Sonia's bed, where she was already awake, clutching the pirate coin tightly in her small fist. "Good morning, Captain Jack," Sonia said softly, a brave smile trembling on her lips despite the fear in her eyes. Johnny quickly moved to her bedside, gently adjusting the pirate hat that had slipped during the night. "Good morning, my brave little pirate," he replied warmly. "Ready for your big adventure today?" Before Sonia could answer, the door opened, and a team of medical professionals entered, led by Dr. Marvey, a renowned oncologist with kind eyes and a reassuring smile. They began the final preparations for Sonia's surgery. Miss Abigail arrived shortly after, slightly out of breath but full of encouragement. She went straight to Sonia's side, taking her hand. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said gently. "Do you remember what we talked about?" Sonia nodded, holding tightly to both the coin and Miss Abigail's hand. "They're going to make me sleep, and then they'll take out the bad stuff in my body," she recited, her voice small but steady. Dr. Marvey smiled approvingly. "That's exactly right, Sonia. And when you wake up, you'll be on your way to feeling much better." As the nurses prepared to wheel Sonia's bed out, Johnny noticed her panic rising. Her eyes darted around the room, and her breathing quickened. Without hesitation, he stepped closer and took her hand. "Hey there, First Mate Sonia," he said softly, slipping into his Jack Sparrow voice. "Remember what we talked about last night? About being brave?" Sonia nodded, her wide eyes locked on his face. "Well, this is your chance to show just how brave you are," Johnny continued. "And you know what? I'll be right here waiting for you when you wake up, just like a faithful captain waiting for his first mate to return from a dangerous mission. What do you say?" Sonia took a deep breath, her small body visibly calming. "Aye, Captain," she whispered, managing a smile as the nurses began to wheel her bed out of the room. Johnny walked alongside Sonia as she was wheeled down the hallway, keeping up a steady stream of pirate-themed encouragement. He held her pirate hat and the golden coin, promising to keep them safe until she returned. At the doors to the operating room, Sonia's fear resurfaced. Her small hand trembled as she reached for Johnny. He knelt beside her gurney, speaking softly but with conviction. "You've got this, Sonia," he said. "Captain Jack Sparrow believes in you. When you wake up, we'll have more adventures together. I promise." Sonia's grip on his hand loosened as the pre-surgery medication started to take effect. With a final drowsy nod, she was wheeled into the operating room, the heavy doors closing behind her. Johnny stood there for a moment, staring at the closed doors, before turning to Miss Abigail. They exchanged a look filled with nervous anticipation, then made their way to the waiting area. As they settled into the uncomfortable chairs, Johnny's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw several missed calls and messages from his agent, publicist, and other business contacts. With a sigh, he silenced the device, his focus entirely on the operating room's indicator light. Miss Abigail noticed and gave him a sympathetic look. "Mr. Depp," she began hesitantly, "I can't help but feel we're imposing on you, your career, your obligations." Johnny shook his head firmly. "Miss Abigail, please. This is where I need to be right now. Everything else can wait." The morning stretched on, with Johnny and Miss Abigail sitting quietly, lost in their own thoughts and prayers for Sonia. The waiting room slowly filled with other anxious families, creating an atmosphere of shared hope and fear. Hours passed. The ticking clock on the wall marked the time, interrupted only by updates from passing nurses. Johnny paced the small area, his eyes constantly drawn to the operating room doors, willing them to open with good news. Finally, after what felt like forever, Dr. Marvey emerged, still in his surgical scrubs. Johnny and Miss Abigail jumped to their feet, their hearts pounding. "The surgery was successful," Dr. Marvey announced, a note of relief in his voice. "We were able to remove the primary tumor and the affected lymph nodes." Johnny and Miss Abigail hugged spontaneously, tears of relief in their eyes. "Thank God," Miss Abigail whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Dr. Marvey's expression turned serious. "This is just the first step. Sonia will need ongoing treatment, chemotherapy, and possibly radiation, depending on how her body responds." Johnny nodded, his face set with determination. "Whatever she needs, doctor. Just tell us what to do." Dr. Marvey outlined the next steps, then a nurse approached. "Sonia is being moved to the recovery room and should wake up soon," she explained. "She'll be groggy from the anesthesia, but you can see her briefly." Johnny and Miss Abigail followed the nurse to the recovery area. As they reached Sonia's bed, they saw her starting to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then landed on Johnny. "Captain Jack," she mumbled weakly, her voice slurred. Johnny smiled and gently placed the pirate hat back on her head, careful to avoid her surgical sights. "I'm here, First Mate Sonia," he said softly. "You did it. You were so brave." A faint smile spread across Sonia's face as she drifted back to sleep. The pirate hat sat slightly askew on her head, a symbol of her courage. As Sonia rested, Dr. Marvey excused himself, leaving Johnny and Miss Abigail to talk. Johnny's voice was calm but resolute. "I want to set up a fund," he said, his eyes steady. "Not just for Sonia's treatment, but for renovating and expanding the orphanage. We can look for a larger place, maybe in the suburbs. There must be other children who need medical care they can't afford. I'm thinking we could add a small clinic to the new orphanage, too." Miss Abigail's eyes widened in disbelief. "Mr. Depp, that's incredibly generous. But are you sure? The costs could be—" Johnny interrupted gently. "I'm sure. My assistant and legal team can start drafting the paperwork immediately." As they discussed the plans, a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. A small group of children, no more than 5 or 6 years old, was being ushered toward Sonia's room by a nurse and a kind-faced woman from the orphanage staff. "Please keep it down and let Sonia rest," the nurse whispered as the children, wide-eyed with worry, whispered among themselves. Their steps quickened as they neared Sonia's room, their excitement and concern growing. "These are Sonia's closest friends from her dorm," Miss Abigail explained. "They've been so worried about her." The children crowded around Sonia's bed, their hushed voices filling the room. One little boy spotted the pirate hat and gasped. "Is she really friends with Captain Jack Sparrow?" he asked, his eyes wide with wonder. Johnny chuckled, crouching to the boy's level. "She certainly is," he said, slipping into his Jack Sparrow voice. And let me tell you, she's the bravest pirate I've ever met." The children's faces lit up with awe, but they remained calm, more focused on checking on their friend than on Johnny's celebrity status. As the day went on, Johnny found himself reading pirate stories to the small group of children. Miss Abigail watched from the couch, her eyes filled with grateful tears. The room came alive with giggles and dramatic gasps as Johnny brought the tales to life with his animated storytelling. Johnny glanced at Sonia. She was awake now, still weak but smiling as she listened to the stories, surrounded by her friends. The golden coin rested on her bedside table, catching the sunlight, a symbol of the friendship that had blossomed in the unlikeliest of circumstances. In that moment, Johnny felt a deep sense of purpose. His life had changed forever since that chance meeting outside the hotel. Challenges lay ahead, Sonia's treatment, setting up the fund, balancing his career, but he was ready. As he resumed the story, weaving tales of brave pirates and grand adventures, Johnny renewed his silent promise to Sonia and the other children. He would do everything in his power to give them the health, happiness, and adventures they deserved. The hospital room, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had transformed into a haven of hope and new beginnings. Surrounded by smiling faces, Johnny knew this was just the start of a meaningful new chapter in all their lives.